Hi guys, this is another video for Cadillac 472-500. This is on the ongoing series of different intakes. This is the Bulldog intake. It was made years ago by a company that wanted to make heads and intakes for other engines. They did all the what they considered kind of orphan engines that there wasn't a lot available for. Now, this is a single plane intake. And like I said, this is the Bulldog version. Now, when they went out of business, the intake got picked up by MTS. And they made it basically using the same mold and made the same intake. Now, these come in two different bolt patterns, either Holly or Dominator, the big Dominator flange. Now, this one was Holly. I bought it new from Bulldog back when they first came out. I have since opened it up to Dominator bolt pattern, though I still need to move the hole over in order to allow a Dominator to bolt up to this. Now, the intake is a big single plane. I mean, if you look in there, it's a big runner, it's a big plenum, and it flows like 360 CFM. Now, just like on the other intakes that we talked about, there is a transition problem because this is coming in square and the stock runner on an iron head is coming in at a bit of an angle. So you do lose some flow from that. Now, a lot of guys have had trouble with this particular intake and getting it to run. And that's partly because the stock head, even ported, you know, a regular port, you're going to get maybe 290 CFM. If you push it and you really work on it, you're going to get 300, 320 maybe. There are guys that will say, oh, I got 340 out of mine. But on my flow bench, most of the time when you get up to 340, it's a pretty unstable port. So I don't really consider that a good port. So flow-wise, the head is going to flow less than the runner. This means there's a drop in airspeed in the runner. So at low RPM, this will give you a lot of trouble on trying to get this intake to run. Now, like I said, it flows 360. The interesting thing is the Boogeyman head flows basically 360 CFM as cast before it's ported. So, and it fixes this transition point. So this intake is actually an outstanding match for the Boogeyman head. As cast, it flows well, the runner flows well, the airspeed stays the same. As long as you get a good enough, big enough carb on it, you make some real power because the head flows more air, the intake flows more air, and the carburetor is big enough to keep up. So I really recommend, if that's the head you're going to run as cast, that you run this intake. And you can look at the Richard Holdner videos. We did that very thing. This intake was just a wonderful match for those heads. It's technically a little big for the stock head, even ported. You basically want, in an intake manifold, even if it's single plane, you basically want it to flow the same through the whole thing. That ensures that you get a decent enough airspeed. When the runner is way bigger, like I said, the airspeed drops. That means at lower RPM, this gets really sluggish. You can have mixture problems, and it doesn't run the greatest. So you wind up either having to put a way small carb on it, which will help, and allow some of this volume to act more like plenum, or something in order to try and pick up the airspeed. Now, like I've done on other intakes, I have debated running a divider straight down this all the way to the floor, just like a dual plane has. That's called a 180 intake. And what that does is basically, like a dual plane, the runner only draws on half the carburetor and half the plenum, and that drives up the airspeed to where the intake could work at a lower CFM flow that the head's going to have even at wide open throttle. So I have debated trying that. I have not done it, so I don't have any dyno information to say if that's really a good idea. But it worked well on some other intakes that I've done. Kind of a fix event. Now, like I said, this is Bulldog intake, and MTS picked it up. So you will find some of these that say MTS on them, and it's the same intake. But there's actually 3 versions of this intake. There's the original Bulldog, there's the MTS one that was picked up that's using the same mold and casting the same intake, but then MTS lost that mold, and so they then made a new mold up, and stuff happens at foundries. Things go out of business, people go away, stuff happens. So the new mold that they made up, if you find one that doesn't have this boss, then that's the 3rd version of this. And basically they forgot to put in the bolt boss. Now remember, Cadillacs have a slight angle on the intake bolt, like a 15-degree angle. And that's why this bolt boss is there. And when they forgot to put in that bolt boss, that makes the bolts hard to fit. Now the other thing about the 3rd version of this is they kind of reduced the runner at the very end. Their thinking was they could port it to a 425, they could port it to a 472-500 with a stock iron head, they could open it way up and port it to their aftermarket aluminum head they were working on, and make it more versatile with just one casting. But most of those didn't get machined. So if you find that one without the boss, you have to think about what you're doing. You may have to port the thing. Now, there are, I meant to get one out, there are these little, wedge washers. And if you look, they're at that 15-degree wedge. And if you don't have this bolt boss, you can use these little wedge washers. And it'd just be like a 3/8 wedge washer. And that'll fit in against the flat surface here and give you the bolt angle so you can actually tighten it down. And that's only for the 3rd version that doesn't have this boss. If you have the 1st or 2nd version, either the Bulldog or the MTS version with this boss, then you're fine. You just have to put the bolt in. Now the other thing that I want to talk about on this intake is it's kind of based off of an intake that Larry used to hand make that was called the I can't think of it. I want to say tarantula, but that's not right. But he used to take a 460 intake and, Black Widow. That's what he called it. Sorry about that. He used to take a 460 intake, kind of cut it up and make it fit and weld it to a flange, and he sold it under the name Black Widow. Now remember, this is back in the 80s where we basically had no other intakes. I mean, and I think he did that through the 90s. And that's part of the reason guys were trying to make a bigger intake that was more readily available, because each of those intakes was handmade. Now, one of the problems with the Bulldog is I think it's basically that kind of intake. I think it's like the Black Widow intake, and it's a modified 460. And I think that's why some of these runners are a little odd. Now, one of the problems with this intake is it's a little hard to get some of these bolts in. So you're going to need reduced head bolts in order to try and fit them in. And it's a tight fit. And I've put a lot of these intakes in various versions. I mean, we have filled these, we have added to the runners, we have done all sorts of things trying to improve this intake. But in all that, the thing that I really learned is I'm always fighting the bolt boss. I'm always fighting, and this one's not bad, but I'm always fighting that dowel pin, which is why in an earlier video I told you to get rid of the dowel pin. And this thing barely fits, and the later ones are even worse, underneath these nubs on the head. That's why I say to grind down these nubs on the head. Now, I haven't even pulled this all the way down. This is just kind of close, but this literally doesn't have a gasket, and it clipped in underneath the nub. It is such a tight fit that guys wind up trying to notch them here and everything else, and that's crazy. If you're going to run this intake, I really, really recommend you remove these nubs from the valve cover boss and just take them down flush, because that'll really help. I also recommend you get rid of the dowel pin, because in this intake you're going to probably be using a gasket anyway, not the valley pan. And it really doesn't need a valley pan. You're going to be much better off with a gasket. So you don't need that dowel pin. And like I said, don't be surprised if you wind up fighting some of these bolts to get them in. And so there's going to be a little fussing around with this intake to make it work. And like I said too, it flows up there. I mean, the nice thing about this intake is that we had it available for the Boogeyman heads, and that it flowed so much. I mean, I've had this on the bench. It's 360 CFM during a runner. Now remember, a stock setup, stock head, stock intake, that's only 226 CFM. This thing flows a lot more. And air is power, but you got to get that air not just through the runner, but into the head. And that's what the Boogeyman head does. And so if you're looking at that, running those heads, this is the intake you probably want to be looking for. And like I said, they're out there. There's been several runs of them. I think Bulldog may have even done 2 runs before they went out of business. But they're kicking around, and sometimes on guys' shelves, because they had trouble making it run on their dead stock Cadillac motor. Now, this is my welding block, but I just wanted to show you how it fit. So anyway, that's the Bulldog MTS intake. If you get one that you want Dominator and it's square flange, this can be opened up and the bolt hole modified. I use a little insert. And I've shown that on the group on Facebook, the 472-500 group. I've showed how I modified these to make them work with the Dominator. Now, if you're really going on the big heads and you're running, big CFM, you really need a big carburetor. So that's why I went ahead and modified this one for Dominator, because if I can get a set of the heads, that's my plan, is to run this on big heads and a big carburetor and make some real horsepower. So anyway, like I said, that's the Bulldog MTS intake. Like I said, I think the basic mold was from a modified, cut up and modified 460 intake, like the Black Widow that Larry Kruzak used to do. And they're out there in several forms and several castings, but now you know what you're kind of looking at and what use it is. So I'll talk to you later. Pick your parts well and have a good day.